venture capital as an asset class sucks. I have an example of a guy that came from a very large company and we hired him as the CEO of one of our companies. He was so committed. He put $3 million of his own money at the same time that we invested, and he was the wrong guy. And in a way, what happened 30 years ago at Intel is exactly what's happening in NVIDIA today. People don't listen to what you say. They just go back to how you make them feel. There's this popular notion that entrepreneurs should look for the right partner within the VC firm and not the right VC firm. This notion of having divas and companies built around divas, something doesn't jive well for me. We have a very simple rule at Celesta. There's not a single deal that we love so much that we can't walk away from it. My partner says for every good deal that's there's another one coming 5 minutes later. Everybody thinks that, Elon is SpaceX and Elon is Tesla. While he's brilliant, amazingly brilliant, the person that's running SpaceX, she's unbelievable. She's the person that's responsible. We're all doing hardware. We come from a hardware background. Everybody hated hardware. Semi was a 4-letter word in the Valley. Nobody wanted to touch it. Now it's all cool and everybody wants to do it. In this new generation of AI, this bright line between a pure software company and a hardware company is blurring. The reason why venture capital in India is not that great is not just because the ecosystem is not vibrant there. It's because...
Hey there everybody, and welcome back to the second video edition of the Desi VC podcast. I'm your host Akash Bhatt, and today I'm extremely thrilled about the guest that I have on the show. He's somebody who spent over 30 years in the industry, first as an operator and then as an investor. He's also somebody that I've looked up to and admired during my investing days. My guest on the show today is Sriram Viswanathan, the founding managing partner of Celesta Capital. Celesta is a cross-border fund investing between the US-India corridor, primarily across deep tech sectors. The fund has been around since 2013, and today they have over $1.1 billion of assets under management, having backed over 100 companies in sectors like construction, drug discovery, cybersecurity, semi-conductors, and many more. I'm particularly thrilled about this episode for a number of reasons, but primarily because Sriram is able to bring all of the wealth of experience and wisdom that he's accumulated over the course of his investing and operating days here to the table and share it with each and every one of us. Over the course of this conversation, we were able to talk about the things that he's learned from investing in companies, being on boards of 10 plus successful organizations, what it takes to invest between the US-India corridor, how do you evaluate deep tech companies, and all the things that he's learned over his time at Intel, IndusAge, and at Celesta. Now, this is a fantastic episode for anybody who wants to understand a little bit more about deep tech, how do you invest cross-border, and for any founder who's trying to understand how venture capitalists think about investing in deep tech companies. So if you're any of the above, then this is the episode for you. But before heading in, I want to take a quick moment to thank each and every one of you for all the love and support that you have shown me when we launched the first video podcast 2 weeks ago. I am extremely thrilled to be on this ride, and we have a number of exciting guests lined up for you over the course of the next few months. So if you have not already subscribed to our channel, this is the moment to do that. Please hit the like and subscribe button and make sure you don't miss out on any of the future episodes. We are also live across TikTok, Instagram, YouTube Shorts, and we also have a newsletter where we take you behind the scenes and tell you about all the things that happened during the course of the conversation that didn't make it to the final edit, and most importantly, the conversations that me and the guests have had before the recording started. Well, there's so many interesting tidbits that the guests share with me which make it to the newsletter as well. So please make sure that you subscribe to us across all of these platforms. So without further ado, now let's head in and listen to my conversation with Sriram. Sriram, welcome to the podcast. I have been looking forward to having this conversation with you for months now. And I'm super glad that we're able to sit down just before the holidays and take a walk down memory lane and uncover all the things that you've accomplished, things that you've been exposed to, and more importantly, all the little tidbits that you've been sharing with me before the recording about your stint in Hollywood and everything else. So before we get into any of that, welcome to the show, and how are you doing?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm doing great. Thanks.
Wonderful. I'm still thinking about where to start this episode from, because you just dropped a big bombshell on me saying you did your stint in Hollywood. So maybe we'll kick off things from, your time at Intel. You spent 20 years at Intel, and you've been part of a generation of entrepreneurs, operators, investors, we're seeing a tremendous shift in the industry, not just in terms of where we are today and in deep tech and all of the things you're doing right now, but also going back to the early days of what the internet looked like back in the late 80s and early 90s. So talk us through that journey and kind of like what kind of got you into this space, and more importantly, what kept you going at Intel for so long?
Yeah, that's a very good question, which is a thank you. First of all, thanks for having me, Akash. It's a great learning experience is how I see the last 30 years has been just one incredible innovation of the other that's happened. And I seem to have got the lottery to sit at the ringside of all of these great innovations and also meet with great people that actually build unbelievable businesses. But if I were to just roll back the clock, I mean, I was trained as a software engineer from Bangalore, and I came first to the US in 1987, and I worked in the auto industry. I worked for Chrysler and Ford and GM and people like that in Detroit. And this was, and my job at that time was really to be a network specialist. I mean, to be honest with you, I didn't know what I was doing. I was, out of college, out of having worked at, Wipro in India for about a year. But it was those days when people in the Midwest, especially some of these large, stodgy old companies in manufacturing, were just about getting started in the networking area of connecting computers and, using, the network, local area network to actually deliver enterprise services, if you will, right? So I had the opportunity to actually work with Ford Motor Company at that time to build the first voice response system. What today we take for granted, press 1 for this, press 2 for this on your cell phone. Those days it didn't exist. And they had an application that they wanted, 50,000 of their employees to use. And they had me, work on that. And I built a voice response system. And that was my first exposure to doing something in what those days we used to call, emerging technologies. And now we kind of have a fancy name for it and call it deep tech. But those days it was pretty deep tech. But that was my exposure to it. And over the years, that just kept, getting me into places where cutting edge of new technology, I somehow had an opportunity to work on it or, evaluate it and such. And my time at Intel really started along those lines when I was supporting the executive office of Gordon Moore and Andy Grove and Craig Barrett, as they were trying to define the strategy for Intel and the vision for Intel and what is to come down the pike. I was the guy who was supposed to go and scout for what's cool out there and somehow weave it into the core Intel strategy and say, you need, much faster, more powerful processing to be able to deliver the sorts of visionary things that's going to happen down the road. So that was kind of my journey. And we could talk about, some of the specifics of it, but it was a long arc from the time I was working on TCP/IP and Token Ring, trying to implement, a networking solution for Ford, to working on multimedia, to working on wireless and a bunch of other things during my time at Intel. So that's kind of how the starting happened.
No, that's fantastic because that gives me an insight into, you talked about emerging technologies as such as this underlying theme that was back in the day, deep tech.
Yeah.
Why was this important for Intel at that point of time? And why were you and the team looking to dig into this deeper, looking into maybe the next 15, 20 years of us?
Well, I think, people don't realize Intel was a very, highly innovative, very engineering focused company. In fact, the joke of those days was, when Intel launched a product, there was so much buzz about the product that a consumer never saw. There's never been an instance where a company spends, billions of dollars marketing a product that the consumer will never see because it was inside the computer. So the whole campaign of Intel Inside was a big deal. You could make the argument the NVIDIA of today is kind of like that because who's ever seen a GPU? Never. But here's this incredible company. So Intel's challenge at that time was to feed this beast that was inside the computer with more and more stuff to do to catch up to the level of performance that was being delivered by the platform. So the job was to go find new things. Was it video? Was it speech? Was it databases? Was it high-end applications or any number of things that could be thrown at the CPU to crunch more and keep it more busy. And the more the computing became a constraint, it was music to Intel's ears because they could go and invest in the next generation of it. And in a way, I mean, it's ironic because, what happened 30 years ago at Intel is exactly what's happening in NVIDIA today.
Yeah.
Because everybody's trying to feed the beast. And, and the more stuff, more data that's being thrown at NVIDIA, they keep coming up with, greater capability, not just in the processor, but, a system level and the software level to actually do training and inference and all kinds of AI applications. But I see a great parallel. So Intel's job was that, and my job was to really go scout for things that actually could showcase the need for higher computing. So that was the reason that I had that job.
Where do you usually start when somebody says, go and figure out where the biggest of the applications are going to be? How do you start looking at different industries and say, hey, let's try and go? Because it's not just about identifying an industry, but you probably also have to educate people in that industry to say that, hey, you've got to be the flag bearers of innovation here.
Well, listen, I think it's part of it is evangelism. Part of it is really testing the limits of the capability of whatever the technology that you're applying, be it compute power, be it memory, be it wireless, be it broadband, any number of these things. You're really trying to find things that'll push the envelope. I mean, case in point, if, as we were just talking before the podcast, those days, the fastest broadband was ISDN. It was 128K. And today I get in my home, I get a gigabit on my cell phone sitting in my, in my den. So just imagine, it's like multiple orders of magnitude faster broadband capability. But in those days, the way you would think about it is that if you used text or if you use, audio, you could possibly do with the lower quality audio on a broadband pipe. But you had to have video for you to break that ISDN limits. If you wanted 30 frames per second, you could have, 15 frames per second. But if you wanted smooth video, so the job was to really keep pushing the edge on the type of applications. And it's less about the actual application, and it's more about what are the constraints that the application will try to break. So video was a great thing. Audio was a great thing. Graphics was a great thing. In fact, don't forget, NVIDIA was built as a graphics company, as a discrete graphics company. Gaming was a big thing. How do you do MMOGs, multiplayer, online games, massively, parallel games, if you didn't have the underlying capability to do, 64 frames per second rendering? So we were really looking for things like that broke the existing infrastructure in a variety of areas. So that's how we would go look at it.
But a company like Intel has the R&D budget to perhaps do that. On the other end, you still had to convince some of these people to adopt these technologies. You gave a good example before the recording about how you had to convince Steven Spielberg to even, change the way that the movies back then went into production, and then telling them that, hey, this is probably going to move the needle a little bit more. And you talked about Shrek in that context.
Yeah. Well, look I think, again, I'm at least dating myself when I talk about things that were so far, long ago, 30 years ago. And those days, if you're doing linear video production, linear entertainment, movies, animation, whatever, you needed, massive workstation class compute devices with, very low latency, high memory bandwidth access, blah, blah, blah. And today you have all of that here. You could create, really high quality video and animation, all that using your, mobile device. But in those days, there were only 2 or 3 choices. Silicon graphics was one. DEC Alpha was one. Intergraph was another. So these are workstation class machines. They were just huge, highly power inefficient, very expensive, specialized software skills and all of that. And so here comes, Intel with whole bunch of high-powered desktop computers. And to my point about networking, because remember, networking also was evolving at that time. So when you tie all of these things together, you have the ability to actually buy lower cost CPU and memory footprint client devices, stick them all together in a massive network, 512 PCs, which were all, $1,000, maybe $2,000 each. And you could build a workstation class, multiple workstation class compute capability that could be applied to make the next movie. So when we met with, the likes of DreamWorks and Universal and others in those days, the value proposition was that, don't go spend, $5 million to buy, 2 or 3 large silicon graphics machines to make your next movie. Just buy, 20 laptops or 20 PCs, stick them together and run a render farm of building animation. So that was the value proposition. And it worked. In a case in point, silicon graphics doesn't exist anymore. Intergraph doesn't exist anymore. Now, some could argue that, Intel also may not exist. But that's the nature of evolution of technology. And if you don't innovate fast enough, and if you don't continue to push the envelope and break the constraints, you will become obsolete. And what happened to SGI, could happen to Intel. What happened to Intel or happens to Intel could happen to any other successful company as well if you don't stop innovating, right? So that's sort of the journey of all of these companies that's happened over the years.
What I'm about to ask you next is with the context of the audience that I have in mind, and also what we're seeing happen in the last 5-6 years, and probably what's going to happen in the next decade as well. You will probably not see, it's a bold bet, not see a lot of people sticking around for 20 years in organizations like you have, unless you're the founder of a company, more or less, or you're at senior leadership levels. What kept you going for 20 years? Where was the hunger internally? And what kind of platform did Intel provide you? The reason I ask that is because as companies are being built, I want founders to start thinking about what's the longevity here, both personally for themselves and what can they do in terms of creating that environment for people to make sure that they stay behind outside of equity on all the other little things that kind of make up a job.
Yeah. Look, I think it's a great question. And I have always tried to explain it in a very simple way. I never thought of my job at Intel as a career. I had fun showing up to work every day, not because it was Intel. It could have been, any other company. But what I was doing, the quality of work that I was doing, which was literally meeting young companies, because we in those days, had an organization that actually evolved to become one of the largest corporate venture groups in history. Intel Capital got formed. So my job was to literally meet with young entrepreneurs who are going to come and tell us about some new idea that they want to build on. And what better place and what better way to learn the coolest stuff that's happening out there. It was like, signing up to being in Columbia or Harvard in the business school, and every day somebody's teaching you something new, and they have spent years thinking about that problem, and you're just getting a sneak view of that in a compressed form. So I didn't think of my job at Intel as working at Intel. I thought of it as I have this ringside view of all the cool things that's happening, and people are coming to see me, to see Intel actually, and tell me about it. And I would go to work just, drunk with just, excitement thinking about that, right? So in a way, the reason I stay there is, and the reason I do what I do today is just that. It's one thing to say, well, how much capital do we manage? How many companies are there? It's more interesting to say, am I learning anything every day that I show up to work? And that keeps you going. And so to me, I think that's the answer for anybody for that matter. Don't do what you're doing just because it's a great option package or, what the exit is going to look like. If you don't really care and like what you do, quit. It could be NVIDIA or it could be Microsoft, but if you don't like what you do, just quit.
That's great advice and suggestion for everybody in general. I heard you on a podcast saying that you didn't really think of, becoming an investor. Not a lot of people actually do when they start on their careers. But if you take a look at your time at Intel, you were almost building up to become an investor in some sense. You were playing the role that you are playing today at Celesta in one way, shape, or form. You were meeting companies, you were evaluating them, you were seeing how best, the business fit between Intel and the organization that you were evaluating. So in a way, accidentally, your job at Intel eventually became the foundation for what, was first IndusAge and now Celesta. Do you look back on your time at Intel saying that it kind of groomed you, molded you, gave you that first level of education required to be an investor in some sense?
100%. There's no question about that. But again, as I'm sure the famous Steve Jobs line, you can always look back and connect the dots, right? But I know the forks in the road that I had at every step of the way. And I'll give you just one anecdote, which was a profound fork in the road for me. I had my usual one-on-ones on some project that I had to do for Andy Grove, who's, obviously a legendary CEO and founder at Intel. Andy used to teach at GSB at Stanford. I had this, maybe looking back, maybe it was a misplaced notion, maybe it was not. I was getting bored in the early days when I was at Intel because it was, you have the moments of weakness where you're wondering, am I doing the right thing? Where is this all headed and all of that? And I'm a physicist at heart and I wanted to really do a PhD. So I went to Andy and I said, I want to go do a PhD. What do you think? Will you sponsor me? And Andy said, why? Why do you want to do it? And Andy, for those of the folks that may have read or known about him, he has this penetrating way of, asking a question that fundamentally shakes your foundation. And I didn't really have a good answer. I came up with a whole bunch of stories and blah, blah, blah. And then he asked me, what do you really like? And I said, I like meeting with people and learning and understanding and all that. Well, PhD ain't for you because you really have to stay on one problem for 6 years and not know whether at the end of it, you've answered it or not. And if you don't have that sort of, diligent patience for that, that's not for it. And that was aha for me because that day I knew that I was not going to be an entrepreneur. I was going to be a venture capitalist. And the reason for that is that as a venture capitalist, you end up meeting with your white band. You're meeting with so many different ideas, so many different entrepreneurs. And, you learn with each one of them, but you're never going to be as good as that entrepreneur, as much as people may claim. You're never going to be as good as them unless you've run an operational business. And I had the fortune of actually running a few operating businesses within Intel. So I honed in my skills in a few areas, but it really drove me to understand the difference between being an entrepreneur and being a venture capitalist. And I chose the latter. And, I'm delighted that I'm doing that because it meets the things that I needed. And even today it does that. So I'm super excited about that.
It's funny you mentioned that you had a very similar conversation with Andy. I had something similar with a professor of mine. I got into a PhD program right after. I was evaluating 2 years out of private equity, whether I wanted to continue working or wanted to go to a PhD myself. And one of the early conversations after the admit I ended up having with the professor, he said, you're not meant to do a PhD. And I said, why do you say that? He said, you're not going to be obsessed about just this thesis.
Yeah.
You're the kind of guy who wants to solve a lot of other problems and you're not probably going to find that here. So don't waste your time 2 years from now. You go look back and say, you know what, I'm going to drop out. I'm going to go back to the world of business and do something else. Might as well just do that right now. That I thought was a very good advice because right after that, I went to venture. And I said, you know what, this is great. And then the only difference between your experience and mine is that I did feel that the entrepreneurial stint would give me the opportunity to look at multiple problems. Because for me, the way I looked at it, I knew that the first idea that I had was probably, if it did turn out to be the thing that we ended up working on, great. But I knew how businesses are usually built. You end up pivoting a lot of times before you actually land on what you do, which is exactly what happened to us. We pivoted in the first 6 months and then had to go through multiple iterations to find what we're doing. We're still trying to figure out our own enterprise story and everything. So that figuring out bit was something that I truly enjoyed.
Yeah, I think it's not to minimize what it takes to be a venture capitalist, because I think a venture capitalist is a far more successful and valuable venture capitalist if you've been an entrepreneur or if you've run an operating business, because it's very difficult for you to sit across the table with a founder and be empathetic to what that founder is going through, hiring, running the operations, running out of money, losing the key talent, all of those things. You cannot pontificate about it from books and just say, oh, I know how it works. Well, you don't. If you've not fired people, if you've not hired people, and if you've not coached people to actually deliver something, more than what they even know they are capable of, if you've not done that firsthand, by running a business, I think you're not quite fully there as a venture capitalist. But that's not to say that they're not great venture capitalists that have never been entrepreneurs. But I fundamentally think operating experience, which is, by the way, what we at Celesta really value. And I think that probably one of the reasons why we've been as successful, because everybody in Celesta, in large part, has been an operator, has been a business builder. Someone that's, my partner, Michael and Nick built Flextronics to a $30 billion business, 240 countries, 1,000 employees. We're talking about the scale of building an operation like that. Now, if somebody comes and says to us, here's a technology that I'm going to try to scale, here are the guys that have actually, done it. And so that there's a lot to say about operating experience combined with, a financial discipline to be a better investor. And we sort of pride ourselves that that's really what we have.
Similar theme that's come about with the 150 conversations that I've had with VCs on the podcast. Everybody says that. Even the ones who don't have a lot of operating experience say that, you know what, when I don't, I take a step back. And I'm able to introduce the people who have had that experience to speak to my founders.
Yeah.
It's really important to understand even yourself as an investor to know where you can jump in and where you can't. You can't anecdotally or just come up with stories that you've heard from other people who've been there and done that. It's quite similar to what happens in business school as well. You're better off going into a business school with 5-10 years of experience, maybe not 10, maybe 5 years of experience, as opposed to somebody who's just come out of undergrad.
Yeah.
You will crack that case study in class.
Yeah.
But everything that you're going to be sharing is based off of somebody else's experience, things that you've read, things that you've heard, as opposed to being there in that situation and knowing that the nuances to that problem statement or that case study are different from what you have in mind, as well as what plays out in your life.
Well, look, I think it's not everything is, dollars and cents in life. And, of course, we have a fiduciary duty to maximize the returns for our investors. It's really important to understand people. Some of the hardest things that I've done in my life is not getting a technology wrong, which we have, but that's not the reason why something fails. It usually fails because either we have not understood the business implication of the technology or we have not understood the people. We've had the wrong people. So I think, and the wrong people doesn't necessarily mean that they are, qualitatively completely flawed. It's just that they are in the wrong job. I'll give you an example. One of our companies is Recognize, which is a great company in generative AI. Company had, multiple founders. One of the founders is just an unbelievable engineering whiz, if you will. He built Juniper, for instance, Anand, RK Anand, and he's the founder. And one day he just put up his hand and said, you know what? I'm not the CEO of this company anymore because I am better at something else. That degree of self-awareness, not everybody has. What's even more difficult is that as a venture capitalist, sometimes, even if it is obvious that somebody is not the right person, you don't have the intellectual honesty and authenticity to really have that conversation with that person and say, you know what, you're a great guy, but you're in the wrong job. Move. It doesn't mean that you have to fire the person. Maybe you have to find something else for that person. And in this case, it was easier for us because he volunteered and we agreed with him. That was the right decision. He's an incredible guy. He's still there. He's the founder of the company. And without him, the company won't be there. But he made the change himself. And to me, I think venture capitalists that are able to execute to that degree of honesty with their people, with the entrepreneur, invariably have a better outcome for the businesses. And that can happen not by staring at spreadsheets, not by saying, did you meet your ARR for next year? You didn't. So hence you're not the right CEO. I don't think that works. It works because of, a number of reasons, and you have to really get to the bottom of that.
Yeah, let's dissect that point a little bit further, because you have two instances that situation arises. The one situation where you as a board member, you as an investor, you perhaps have to have that awkward conversation with the CEO and ask him or her to step down for whatever reason. And then you have the second situation where, the CEO comes to you and says, hey, you know what? I don't think I'm the best person to be leading the company from here on.
Yeah.
I think my mileage is run out. In both these conversations, they're not easy to have.
Yeah.
Of course, you have to have that conversation with the CEO who is reluctant, may not want to step down. How do you manage that situation? And the other situation as well. In this case, you obviously were able to be in cahoots and agreed with the CEO, him stepping down. But what if you didn't?
Yeah.
What if you felt, hey, maybe you're overthinking the situation. Maybe you are the right person. Maybe the other aspects of the business need to be the one that needs to be restructured. How do you manage those conversations?
Well, listen, each case is different. And I don't mean to suggest that we get it right all the time at all, because there are lots of, for every example that I can give where we've got it right, either by our own volition or aided by a very self-aware entrepreneur.
Yeah.
There are enough examples where we didn't have either one of those. We made the wrong bets. We delayed firing the CEO, all of that. But that said, what I have seen work is that, there's this famous line, people don't listen to what you say. They just go back to how you made them feel. If they know that you are authentic, if they know that you didn't play games, you didn't give some bullshit answer, reason why they have to not be there, but you were really, straight with people. You're just honest with people. It makes them feel respected. It's unbelievable when you get people feeling respected to what extent that they will go to do stuff for them. So stuff for you. So I have an example of a guy that, I wouldn't name the CEO, great guy, came from a very large company. And, we hired him as a CEO of one of our companies. And he was so committed. He put $3 million of his own money at the same time that we invested. So he didn't take any salary. He invested $3 million in the company, and he was the wrong guy. So I said, man, this is not working out. So now think about the complexity of it. Now, he put his savings into the company that he believed because he was betting on himself. It was a wrong bet. He was betting on himself. And I was able to call it and say it was a wrong bet. So I had to fire him. And I did. And today, he's running a very large company. I was his reference to get the job. And I said to him, you were the wrong guy for this job. That doesn't mean that you're inherently a bad guy or you can't do another big thing. And fortunately, he ended up in that. And he's now trying to figure out how to make that company work with the company in which he was the CEO, because there is a synergy with these two companies. But the point being that when people appreciate how you made them feel and you treat them fairly and honestly, it's like hot knife and butter. They'll do whatever you ask them to do. And that's, it just comes back to just some basic simple rules. Just be straight with people.
It's all about relationships and people, isn't it?
Totally. I think this is the part that I really bothers me sometimes, because, we have a whole bunch of, I would say younger firms and younger investors. And it is less about that relationship. If the relationship is really strong enough, you would hire and fire without a problem. You don't have to be founder friendly by saying that, I got to, my relationship is so strong that I have to keep you. No, if the relationship is so strong, you can let him go much easier. So I think, that's the skill that I think you have to hone in every time. And we try very hard. And sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. But, it's that awareness that one has to have.
It's a lost art. In my opinion, and just managing people and relationships is somewhat, we're losing that art of how to do it, because a lot of people just want to have a very superficial conversation.
Yeah.
And people are, and this is my generation of founders. I see a lot of them, with few exceptions, doing a good job of trying to maintain relationship to a certain extent where there's a business outcome. But the cementing of the relationship goes a little beyond that, getting to know the person a little bit more, trying to go above and beyond to not just meet their customer demands, but getting to understand who is the person behind the persona that you're selling.
Yeah.
That is a very hard skill set for somebody to learn.
Well, it's a very hard skill set. And not to mention, I think we have this, we as human beings, we make a mistake. At the end of the day, we're all just social animals. Yeah. And we pretend as if we have 10 boxes and they're all, well contained, and we operate within each box. And there's a clear, bright line between one box and the other, when it doesn't. Yeah. It doesn't exist like that. I mean, if I have my, one of my relatives is sick or is cancer, whatever, I'm preoccupied with that, right? And I may show up to work and I'm fully engaged, but I have something weighing on me. And if you as an investor or a manager of that person, if you don't have a deep appreciation of what makes that person not just tick, what makes that person not tick, if you don't understand that, how can you expect the best out of that person? So, I mean, to me, not everybody would agree. I think for me, give me a good person who is self-aware, open to feedback, and listens, and a bad business plan, I would always fund it. But give me the reverse. Give me a great business plan, and the guy doesn't listen, it's hard. I think you should walk away. I mean, we try to walk away. And, so that's I always overweight on relationship for that reason.
I completely agree with you. And this is one of the reasons why my thesis, when I replied for my PhD, was taking the best performing sports teams or the high performing sports teams and bringing that culture to the tech industry.
Yeah.
How do we put that into real world?
Yeah.
That was going to be my thesis. And one of the reasons why some of the best successful teams in the world have been able to bring superstars out of them, Michael Jordan being one of them.
I was just going to say,
is you got to understand who the person is. If you watch the documentary Last Dance,
I was just going to say that. Yeah.
Every person on that team, coach really, really knew who that person was, what motivated them, what didn't motivate them, when they needed a break, when Dennis Rodman had to go to Vegas to have his night off.
Absolutely.
It's giving them what they needed. It's not just about getting the best out on the court. It's knowing what are the things that actually bring the best out on the court is really what makes a good leader or not.
You bring up a very interesting point, because I think, there's this, popular notion that entrepreneurs should look for the right partner within the VC firm and not the right VC firm, because it's less important what the VC firm is, but if you find the right partner is good. While that is true, I have a slightly different point of view, which is when you have everybody in the partnership thinking of, a deal as a deal of the firm and not as a deal of a partner, you have much better outcomes. So what does that mean? It means that you have to have the incentive structure completely changed. It's less important who sourced the deal, and it's more important how the entire team works together to get the right outcome out of that deal once we've invested. So we, for instance, we don't have any weightage on deal sourcing. We don't have any weightage on a deal a partner is working on. We all eat off the same plate. If a deal succeeds, everybody benefits. So there's one carry pool, nothing assigned to any one deal. So that allows for each of our partners to work very well together. And, there has to be pride of ownership. There cannot be pride of self-ownership. I'm the only person that's responsible for something. It never happens. There's not a single company that you can, notwithstanding some of the examples to the contrary now, because everybody thinks that, Elon is SpaceX and Elon is, Tesla. While he's brilliant, amazingly brilliant, the person that's running SpaceX, she's unbelievable. She's the person that's responsible. So it's really a whole big team that comes together. And it sounds cliched, and, people just sort of roll over their eyes and say this is all, foo-foo and all that. But I think there's real value in working collaboratively. And within Celesta, it's exactly what it is. And each of us brings a very different perspective. And, you don't overweight on one, but you just take the best out of everything, right? So
for every mark, you need a shuttle.
Totally. Well, it's more than that, right? I mean, you've got, so many people. Yeah. It's, this notion of having divas and companies built around divas, it's something doesn't jive well for me. That's not to diminish some of these absolute visionaries of our time. Right. Apple is a classic example, right? I mean, Tim Cook has generated more shareholder value than Steve Jobs ever did. Yeah. And, people forget. And, Tim used to work for Steve in those years. It's bringing all of that together, I think is crucially important. And it applies to companies of any stage and size. It doesn't matter. You really need the team clicking. But I tell you this, when you have a team clicking, it is night and day, and you can see it. A board meeting that goes more than 1 hour invariably is probably inefficient. And if you have, the best board meetings are, I mean, we have an example of a company called Auradine, and it was a great company. Company shows up, and the CEO shows up and says, well, here's what I told you last time. Done, 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 done. Everything's done. Any questions? Anything else that we should do differently for the next time around? Done. The meeting is over, right? So when you're crisp, when you really run it tightly, and you have a great team that works together, It's night and day.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, you can't have all your companies like that. It's like, not all of your children are above average. Right. So
you bring up two thoughts in my head. First one was with respect to like the divas, right? Eric Schmidt, quite famously said, you got to let the divas be the divas because every company needs a diva. But when he says that, what I think he was trying to say is you can't be a diva. You're born a diva. Like you can't, I can't look at Elon Musk and say, I'm going to be that kind of a personality. You're either that person or you're not.
Well, listen, first of all, you can't try to be something that you're not.
You're not.
And if you're good at staying by yourself in a room and coding as heck and creating this, you can pull off like a 36-hour stretch. That's what you're good at. And the power and the benefit of being a good leader is to be able to identify that and letting them alone. And having them do what they do. The problem occurs when people pretend something that they are not. And what is worse is that the people that have to call bullshit when they don't, it just leads to suboptimal outcomes, right? So, that's the problem, right? So
absolutely. And I've also seen maybe being that diva in the early days or trying to be who you're not in the early days, say it works for whatever, unlikely use case there is. It doesn't last a long time. It probably works for you for maybe a year or two, but you're going to get called out at some point of time because you also get tired playing that role. I don't think you can play a role indefinitely if you're not that person. Putting on a second act at work is incredibly hard because at some point, either that pours over to who you are in real life, which of course, then you end up isolating a lot of people in your life, or you just get tired of playing that role, which again, someone's going to call you.
Well, listen, I think we have a very simple rule that, at Celesta, there's not a single deal that we love so much that we can't walk away from it. For, like my partner, Nick Brathwaite, who says for every good deal that's there's another one that's coming 5 minutes later. It's like a bus. There's another one coming 5 minutes later.
Yeah.
So what? If you did all the, good deals that you think are good, you will end up doing a lot of bad deals. You have to let some deals go. It's okay. And it's the same thing with being an entrepreneur. It's almost like an oxymoron. You have to say that you have to have conviction in your idea and you have to be in it. But on the flip side of the coin, you have to be equally adaptive. You have to be able to just chuck it and say, you know what? I'm not going to do that anymore. Whatever I thought was the best thing since sliced bread is not. I mean, case in point, we were talking about Intel earlier. Intel was a memory company. And the Japanese were kicking Intel's butt like crazy in the 70s. And imagine you're in the peak of it and you're the king of the hill in DRAM and competition is knocking at your door and they're going to take it all over. And you have to have the gumption to say, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to just quit that business. I'm going to create something new. I have no position in that. And I'm going to try to build it. And that adaptability is so important for entrepreneurs. And it's equally important for investors. You have to stay in it, but you have to be able to say, you know what, cut your losses and just move on. When I read Nikesh Arora also at the All-In conference, he was talking about Masa. And Masa's philosophy, I think, is brilliant, which is, don't linger on your failures so much. Just move on.
Yeah. And
I have just a corollary. Don't linger on your successes too much either. So what? You did a incredible company, $10, $20 billion, 5 years ago. So what? Let's look at, what can we do something now? And I think that adaptability and sort of self-awareness is so important, I think.
Yeah. I don't know if this is a Rudyard Kipling poem or something that says, weigh your wins and losses the same way. And
it is. Yeah.
Don't try and keep, hopping over one for a long time. Just look forward to what's coming up next because that's what people are going to remember you for, what you do next.
That's right.
Your past is going to get it.
It's over. Look at it. Thomas Watson is not remembered. IBM, right? Sam Palmisano is, incredible CEO of IBM. I remember, the guy who actually transitioned IBM from being a big blue box company to a software services company. Yeah, okay, fine. It's great. But I think that we all get caught up in our own ego in a very big way, I think.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
For sure. We haven't even talked about Celesta in any way since that I wanted to. at the start of the podcast. So let's, shift our focus a little bit more towards, first maybe IndusAge and how that morphed into what you're doing today at Celesta. What kind of initially gave you the conviction that this was the right path forward for you? Of course, you'd been looking at early stage companies and everything, but you talked about a few things that are really important for a fund to come into place. And we're not just talking about capital that needs to be raised. Sure, that'll come in eventually. But the core important aspects of a fund are, the people, the thesis, and the philosophy with which you run the fund going forward.
Mm-hmm.
How in the early days of Indus and at Celesta did these three important components or fundamental pillars of a fund get instilled?
Well, listen, I think, when I left Intel, I had actually made a decision to leave Intel. It just took me 2 years to leave. And it happened, just serendipitously that I went to India multiple times at that period. And I was very intrigued at that time. It was in the 2008-9 timeframe. Obama had become the president. There was this huge wave of optimism of, global collaboration, and life was going to be different, all of that. And India was also sort of evolving from sort of the services mindset on IT consulting services to, doing, I wouldn't call it deep tech, but more product-related possibilities. And I was very intrigued at that time. I actually was one of my friends who was the CTO of the U.S. government at that time, included me on a trip that the White House was making with Obama, and I went with them, and it was to really look at wireless infrastructure that was going to get proliferated in India for high bandwidth wireless. And I was very intrigued about the possibilities of creating young companies, which were based on some foundational IP. So 2008 is when I thought about that. And when I left Intel, I wanted to build something US-India. That corridor was very attractive for me for all the obvious reasons. And IndusAge was really a play of words, right? India, US, age, blah, 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 all of that. And we built it, and it was a very small firm. And to my earlier point of who you travel with on the road is more important than the actual journey. And so to me, it was very clear that for me to really try and scale this, it was not going to be sufficient to just have a small, 2-member sort of a partnership to do it. I had to partner with other people. And I had the great fortune of meeting with Michael Marks and Lib Bhutan and Nick Brathwaite, and they had a fund, and it was called Walden Riverwood Ventures. And so we actually merged our activity, and it became WRVI, Walden Riverwood Ventures IndusAge. And that's what Celesta is. So it all came together because of shared values and shared sort of mindset on what we're going to do. I mean, case in point, I'll tell you consistent with the earlier conversation about not everything is, dollars and cents. We didn't even figure out what our respective economics were going to be well past the merger, and the economics were decided like 2 years later. So it was more important to figure out, are you sitting in the room with the right people? Can you actually learn from the right people? And that became one of the key reasons why we've been successful. So now, we're on our 5th fund, and we have 100 companies in the portfolio. We have exited 35 companies, and chips are cool again, because, we were doing, right from the time when I was at Intel, and when the other guys at Celesta, they were all doing private equity. They were all doing deep tech. We were all doing hardware. We come from a hardware background. Everybody hated hardware. Semi was a 4-letter word in the Valley. Nobody wanted to touch it. Now it's all cool and everybody wants to do it. And, we've been sort of, in that journey, and that sort of helped us in a big way, because now, notwithstanding the fact that we're a small fund, people know that if you're in hardware, if you're building the next generation semiconductor or systems or sensors or IoT, whatever you call it, they know that we're the guys that have been at it, and we really understand it. We understand how to scale it and all that. And the second point is that in this new generation of AI, this bright line between a pure software company and a hardware company is blurring. Who would have thought that, Microsoft would have 10,000 hardware people or semiconductor people? Apple, is it a software company? Is it a hardware company? I mean, it's like that line is blurring, right? So that has actually played very well for firms like ourselves, because we can now invest in companies, and that many more potential strategic partners that could get interested in our companies. And so those are the ways by which we have actually evolved. and we're doing great. So
They often say that when you meet a portfolio companies or founders of a VC fund, you kind of like get to understand the dynamics of the investors themselves, and vice versa as well. You meet the investors, you kind of get a sense of what the founders are. I don't think that's necessarily true, but where I do feel what people say when they say that is the underlying fabric of who you connect with from a personal level remains the same. Do you feel the same with your portfolio founders and how you guys have thoughtfully gone about with your construction?
Well, I think it's a bit overstated, right? I mean, when people tell me that this is sort of the portfolio composition that we're going to make N number of companies with this, and it's all fine on a PowerPoint. The reality is very different.
You don't go about doing that.
Well, there's no roadmap to say, okay, what are the next 3 companies like this you're going to do, and what are the next 5 companies you're going to do like that? That doesn't exist. That said, I think it's important to at least have a point of view on key areas. I mean, what do you believe in? What's your I don't want to call it investment thesis, but that sounds highfalutin. It's really, what do you believe? Do you believe the notion of everything moving, for example, moving to the cloud is an irreversible transition? Do you believe that's going to sustain? Or do you believe that inherently there are some advantages to have a hybrid approach between IT and the cloud? It's better for a certain class of workloads to have certain things in the IT infrastructure and certain things on the cloud. Likewise, in AI, do you believe there's going to be certain advantages to have inference at the edge versus inference at the data center? And if it is, what are the implications of that? So I think you have to have a point of view on that, which can be a guidepost in sort of defining your sort of predilections on whether you'll get interested in a particular company or not, notwithstanding all the other issues about financials and management and all of that. You have to have a point of view. And I think, we try to do that. Like, I'll give you an example. I think, security, cybersecurity. I think the whole world underestimates the potential and the critical need of solving cybersecurity, because it's one of those things that's never going to get fully solved.
Right.
For each, unbelievable cybersecurity company, RSA, Palo Alto Networks, any of these companies, there's always an opportunity for new innovation because the market is so complex, so difficult. So you have to have a point of view about that and say, where are the areas where value can be created? Not every value creating opportunity as an investor has to be a $50, $100 billion company. It doesn't have to be. I'm just as happy making a company that is $5 billion if I've invested the first check at $5 million in valuation. I'm just happy, right? So I think value creation doesn't necessarily mean that you have to, hit it out of the park every single time. Our investors give us money to, maximize the returns in the scale that we're in. And that's the most important thing.
So when you talk about, let's say, the ownership aspect and understanding when not every company needs to be a $100 billion, $10 billion company, do you then just need to understand what is going to be your appetite and when you're going to pull out and have a secondary exit? And
absolutely. Well, listen, I think this is the other important point that we believe in. Venture capital as an asset class sucks.
Yeah.
If you, my partner has a great line. I mean, if somebody gave you money and if you can return the capital in a near term, in 3, 4, 5 years, you shouldn't be a venture capitalist. You can always make, multiples on top of it. But for you to get your DPI, which is distributions of the capital, paid in investment, if you can make, a multiple on your investment in a reasonable period being 5 to 6, 7 years or less, you invest in 3 years, and if you can't make a return 3 years from the time of investment, something is wrong. Why do I need to lock up my liquidity for that long?
You're better off investing in.
Yeah. So DPI is very important.
Yeah.
So for us, IRR is important, MOIC is important, DPI is the king. Returning regular capital back is absolutely important. So I think that culture in venture has not been there. I just saw the data just this morning. 2013. Okay, so let me just throw it out. 2013, which is our first fund. 2013, if you're in the top decile, okay, it was like 10 years ago. If you're in the top decile, what do you think is the DPI of a 2013 fund, top decile? 11 years out. What do you take a guess? What would be the DPI, a multiple of capital that you have returned? The top decile is like 2-ish in 10 years.
Is that it? I probably was thinking maybe 7 or 8 or something like that.
Top decile. I'm talking about top decile of all the investors. You take the top decile, it's 2-ish. Yeah. Our fund is 5x DPI in 2013 fund. So I think venture capital in general has been a bad asset class. There are a lot of reasons for it. In the case of India, in fact, somebody told me yesterday, the reason why venture capital in India is not that great is not just because the ecosystem is not vibrant there. It's because the public markets have done a phenomenal job. So when I'm an investor and I have disposable capital, I'm rather, put money in the public markets and get a 15% or 20% return with the liquidity that I have inherently built in versus locking up my capital for 7 years and returning 2x. I mean, that's a brain dead idea. So I think it's important for venture capital firms to really understand that. And the ones that do, are in the top decile. But in general, it's abysmal, the results have been.
So even when you're talking about, let's say, a larger AUM, and we're taking the case of, let's say, an Andreessen here, or any of the ones who are managing $5 billion plus of capital, for them to actually give you a respectable return, even let's say a 5x return, you're probably looking to chase after a Databricks.
Well, listen, first of all, I think we talk about this all the time with all our investors and internally. Somebody that's managing over $1 billion, they're not a venture capital firm.
Right.
Okay. They're not a venture capital. I mean, they may be great at doing what they do. Andreessen Horowitz is a great firm. I have nothing against that. I'm just saying that you cannot be managing, $2, $3, $4, $5 billion of capital and expect to have the classic venture capital returns, because that doesn't work. And for every Databricks that is there or OpenAI that's there are probably 5,000 that barely, return capital. So to me, the smaller the fund, the better it is. So I think, in our view, 500 is probably the edge of it for venture capital, because it's easier to find a $100 million exit than a $1 billion exit.
Right.
And, so if you have a $500 million fund and, you return 3 companies that are $100 million, more than half of your fund is returned. And that's a great place to be in. Yeah. And, so I think it's really important to venture capital firms they're really smaller, it's better. And there has to be, reverse to the mean, right? So it's like, valuations are ridiculous. And, we just don't like all of that.
Isn't that also why I think with Greylog that's tied in at they don't raise anything beyond a $500 million?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know about Greylog, but there are a lot of people that have that same mindset. But, listen, I think in a world of hype and the world of, lots and lots of liquidity and capital, it has to, and capital is like water. It has to go somewhere. And, and that, the healthy dose of greed will do it.
Yeah.
You will build, large platforms and they can't return capital. So that's a problem.
So where does the whole thesis behind, building that US-India corridor still come into place if India is still not given those kind of mature?
Well, I think that's a great question, because I think there are lots of things now that are in India's favor, right? I mean, everybody's sort of looking at as second source of supply, sort of deleveraging from China. India, it's also sort of maturing the infrastructure, digital infrastructure. I'm not talking about the roads. I mean, you're from Bangalore, you know how it is. And, the digital infrastructure is stunning, absolutely stunning. So to me, I think the opportunity to actually build high value, companies that leverage the digital infrastructure is really now. I think, 5 years ago it was there, but not as much. And 10 years ago, it absolutely was not there. And so it was okay to have the Flipkart and, delivery and companies like that, the shared economy companies get built. It's all great. But those were really not technology innovations. They were more, business model innovation. We have a company called Agnico, which is, you probably know, it's it's kind of like a 3D printed rocket that goes into the rocket that, delivers payload on the lowest cost per kilogram of payload on suborbital, launches, which is stunning, right? And this is a company that's, remarkable. 5 years ago, you couldn't have thought of a company like that. And today you have that company. 5 years ago, you couldn't have thought of a company that actually makes, generative AI, software for the marketing campaigns. And we have a company like that called Pixis. So there's, that's all changing now because the availability of the infrastructure that's improving, the availability of the software tools that are there. The question is, where's hardware in this thing? I mean, as you know, I'm on the board of the India Semiconductor Mission, and the Indian government's commitment to fabless semiconductor companies is not quite as much as fabs. You hear all these, Micron setting up a factory and Lam Research setting up a, factory and all of that. That's all great. But India still has a ways to go for fabless companies. And I think hopefully in the next 5 years, that might happen. And so we think that the macro issues of every other market not being as attractive, plus some of the infrastructure changes digitally that's happening in India, plus the evolution of the Indian entrepreneur happening like the way it's happening, is really the reason why the US-India corridor becomes a greater focus. I mean, we all know what's going on in Israel. Until things sort of settle down, the instability is not very conducive for building great companies. We have a whole bunch of them, but they're not the ones that we're focusing on as a geography as much as the North America-India corridor.
How much does the geopolitical / regulatory infrastructure and maybe just the landscape in India impact the kind of investments that you're even thinking about making?
Well, listen, I think it's a complicated topic because I think there are, it's good, but not quite helpful because you don't have sophisticated technology investors domestically in India.
Right.
And why is that important? Because you cannot expect a, American venture capital firm to come and identify and deploy capital in India if you don't have a local ecosystem wanting to bet on those same things. And the Indian family offices and large institutions, which all we know very well, they don't have the same appetite to deploy their capital in their backyard. And if you don't do that, how does it work? You can't expect somebody else to come and, deploy capital. So that's an inherent problem. It's not a regulatory problem. It's an inherent problem that they have. And then the second thing is technology companies don't know borders. So if you artificially create impediments for capital flows in the border, then that is inherently a bad thing. So LRS is the only scheme by which an Indian investor can take capital outside of India to invest in a company outside of India. A company outside of India is not saying, okay, well, I'm not going to go target India at all, and I'm just going to target the US. That doesn't happen. So inherently creating inefficiencies in capital outflows out of India. I mean, I know the reasons why they do that, but I think there has to be a better way to manage that, to provide incentives for companies to come into India, capital to come into India, and capital to actually flow out to India to the extent that there is an inherent benefit, at the back end for India. So I think those are regulatory things that, we're working with the government to see if we can influence them, and who knows, but we'll see. But those are some of the challenges.
You're talking about one of the things that you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, which is you're not seeing a lot of great returns with ventures and asset class. Also probably why it's called an alternate asset class, even today, with you're saying 2x returns or so in general. And then you're also saying that deep tech in general requires patient capital.
Yeah.
With both of these factors kicking in, why would family offices
give you money? Yeah.
Give you money, or why are
absolutely
going to be interested in this space? Or how do you get them interested in this space if it has to be patient and
well, listen, this is the reason why we exist.
Yeah.
If you don't provide DPI, if you don't exceed the norm, the median, and you have to be really meticulously focused on returning capital, right, and returning, a good multiple. So to me, I think in certain segments. If you do sort of momentum investing, I think there is a reason to say that you're not going to be able to deliver the kind of results that your investors are going to expect. If you go back to the fundamentals, you go back to sort of being very diligent on valuations. If you go back to what is the inherent value add in some of these companies that we as a venture firm can add to provide nonlinear return. If you can't figure that out, you shouldn't be in the business. We've been very successful in attracting capital from number of corporates, for instance, the likes of Qualcomm and Micron and Nokia and others. They've all been investors in us, among a whole bunch of others as well. And I think it's important to really stick to your knitting and focus on adding value. It works for us.
Yeah.
Not looking for 100x has worked for us, because if you return 5 to 10x, brilliant. You will deliver the numbers that you're looking for. And I think if you had that sort of a focus in everything that you do, combined with sort of the operational help that you can provide, I think you have a good story. But numbers don't blush. You have to have returns.
How much of that numbers kind of gets skewed with investments in the US versus investments in India, with the investments in the US giving greater returns? But when you take a look at it from an overall fund perspective, it kind of evens out, right?
The reality is that it's a portfolio at the end of the day, and a fewer percentage of your companies are going to provide outsized returns relative to the others. But that said, you have to focus on the loss ratio, right? And our loss ratios are much lower than industry standards. At the same time, on the flip side of it, we don't have a company that's returning 100x either. So I think it is okay if you're a little bit more conservative on the upside, but that has an impact on the downside as well. If you limit our downside, I think you're in a band which actually has the potential to deliver a reasonable return, but you cannot make it up. It's kind of like, margins are bad, let's make it up in volume. It doesn't work. One geography is bad, let's make it up in another geography. It doesn't work. You have to have the discipline to do it right. We have not invested in any of the consumer internet or SaaS companies in India, for instance, for that matter, in globally. We've not done that. While it was, much in fashion, everybody was interested in it. Lots of people have made a lot of money in that. We have not done that. But what we have done is we have actually invested in core technology that has actually sustained over a much longer period of time. And it has been very gradual in its growth, but it has resulted in, great outcomes for our investors.
That makes sense. And building on that question a little bit further, if you're talking about making deep tech a much more investable thesis and making LPs obviously more excited about it, two things need to happen. One, you need to educate the LPs a little bit more and give them more conviction that, hey, there's going to be, or build conviction on their side that there's going to be enough returns for them to be investing in this thesis. And the second is actually returning the capital.
Yep.
How do you go about doing the former? Like, how do you educate? How are you educating more investors about this?
The case in point is in our firm, for the first 4 funds, we have only raised capital from people that are either in technology, like many of them are strategic investors, the corporates. Large financial institutions that have invested in insurance companies and banks and such. And largely it is because of the relationship. It's not because they've wanted to diversify in their asset class and said, okay, we want a venture exposure. While some of them do, that's not the reason they've invested in us. It's largely because of our relationship. And the third is really large, family offices who know us, they've made money with us, and they know the way we operate, and they like the sort of the genetic makeup of us. But now, if you want to scale it, if you want to become truly multi-generational, sort of fund family, it's inevitable that you have to have some of the sovereigns, you have to have some of the endowments and others. So we're starting to, have those conversations, and it will happen because we have the results. As some of these large endowments, they don't really like to underwrite a new manager, because what they want to do is they want to pick the few, they underwrite multiple generations of them, and that's it. The job is done. Right. Now, of course, they fire managers, maybe not as often as they should, but they do, but their intake is much smaller. But I think it happens with results, right? So we have actually, the people that are around the table with us are super convinced, and that's why they are in multiple of our funds. But we have an active program to expand it as well.
What's the motivation for the ones who are thinking about, not the ones who fall into the 4 classifications that you mentioned?
Yeah.
The new generation of LPs who are coming in. What's the motivation? Is it diversification?
No, it's less about that. It's about what I said earlier, which is now they realize hardware is a huge opportunity.
Right.
And the industry didn't focus on it. But don't forget, Silicon Valley started as it's called Silicon Valley. It's not called Software Valley. Arthur Rock and Venrock were the first investors in Intel, for instance. So the whole environment in the Valley got built with Hewlett-Packard and Cisco and Intel and all of these places because of hardware. And over the last, I would say, 20 years, there was a whole bunch of other companies that got created, which were very significantly focused on software and social media and companies in non-hardware based technologies. And, a lot of people made money on it. And as a consequence, the hardware ecosystem didn't develop as much in the sort of startup world. And now there is a, retrenchment back to that. So some of these large endowments and funds are now saying, well, damn, we should be doing that. And so it's perfect for folks like us because they see us being, true to our sort of knitting and building those sorts of companies.
It's good to know that there's an appetite among
absolutely
new age investors.
There is. I mean, the other thing is that as I said before, when you had a hardware company, you could name in a single hand the number of potential buyers, right? And it could be Broadcom, it could be Motorola, it could be Intel, it could be whatever. But now you have Facebook, you have Apple, you have Microsoft, you have Oracle. All of these players become potential acquirers because they are committing and they're investing significant amount of capital from their balance sheet in those areas. So I think that is also another driver for some of these large institutional investors to focus on this area.
Right. And when you're looking at your portfolio companies and your existing founders, how are they thinking about not just building their companies, but potential exits? That could be an IPO, that could be, selling to companies. What mindset are they building with?
Well, listen, I think everybody wants to build the next Snowflake or the next NVIDIA. There's no question about it, right? But something happens along the way, which is they subperform, right? Or they get an exit, and it's getting a $50 million exit as an entrepreneur can be life changing for people, and they can exit very quickly through an M&A. So in general, I think wanting to go public is a much longer haul. It's you have to really believe in delayed gratification to really go through that. And being a public company is not a fun business for a variety of reasons. And selling it to one of the larger players is much easier. So the propensity for an entrepreneur in general is to really sell. And now I think there are humongous companies that are private, and Databricks, case in point, or OpenAI or SpaceX. They're private for as long, and there's a vibrant secondary market for the entrepreneur. And so the reason to go public is not as, lucrative and as attractive as it was before, because there's, many other ways to find liquidity.
Right. Now, we're almost towards the end here. And I want to really touch base upon the things that you have learned while investing. Of course, we'll leave the Intel bit out because I think if we can go down that route, there'll be a lot more that we can touch upon. But just working with, the founders, the LPs, your team, looking at the industry at large, what have you learned about yourself?
Oh, that chapter is never done, right? Because you're learning every day. I keep asking myself, what would I do differently? I think I would listen more. I would stay humble more, and I would actually accept the decisions that have led to not great outcomes sooner. So it goes back to the point that I made about, everybody talks about, IQ and EQ and all of that, which is all great. Yeah, I do believe an emotional quotient is hugely, hugely more important than raw intelligence. And I think even more important than emotional quotient is the adaptability quotient. I mean, to the extent that you can have a degree of self-awareness and change, I think you're better off at it, right? So I wish I had more adaptability quotient earlier in my life than what I have now. And that's kind of my learning, right? It's a moment of awareness. So
Do you almost have to wait for
to get the gray hair? No.
to get the gray hair in some sense, because you got to like fail a million times
Oh, absolutely.
before you can develop the skin for actually becoming more adaptable.
That's the other point, right? I mean, I have learned more from my failures than my successes.
Yeah.
And it's kind of cliched. Everybody, probably knows that, but we don't really apply it. I mean, the point that I made about my journey in really driving the wireless efforts when I was at Intel, we were in love with the technology, and we didn't quite appreciate there are many ways to accomplish the same outcome of what that technology could have enabled. And we perhaps should have focused on the outcome versus the raw bits and bytes of how that outcome was going to happen. And we focused on a particular modality of implementing the technology versus the outcome. Because, today you have 5G, you have LTE, they're great. It's just that, they're controlled by the cellular industry, and, Intel didn't like that. But that's the wrong battle. The battle was, how do I enable all of these mobile devices and, drive compute, if that was my whole thesis. How do I enable that? And what pipe I use, I should be ambivalent to that.
Right.
But we were not. But this is the problem, right? When you fall in love with your own creation, when you fall in love with your own technology,
you're blindsided.
And you forget what is the core problem you're trying to solve. And that's the learning for all of us in various ways. And it applies to a startup founder as a gray-haired venture capitalist is. So
yeah,
right.
One of the last things that I want to talk about is, I heard you were on a panel where you mentioned you walked up to one of your first bosses at Wipro and said, it wasn't your first boss either. Just walked up and said, I want a job.
Yeah.
And the person was able to take you under their wing and give you that first opportunity. And today, here you sit across the table from me, your words, not mine, gray-haired investor with all his wisdom and experience and thoughtfulness when it comes to making decisions. As somebody who started off making that impulsive decision to go out and ask for a job to who you are right now, what has been the evolution or just the mental model with respect to decision making in your life?
Well, it's again, I'll profess it by saying I don't get it right all the time, right? Obviously not, right? I think going in with, I don't know the answer. Like when I walked up in Bangalore into Wipro offices, I didn't even know who the boss was. I mean, I couldn't even tell the security guy in the front, I'm here to see somebody. I just told him, I want to see the boss. And the guy says, who are you? And I said, I'm a student and I have no idea who the boss is. And the guy went and told the boss. And
said, CTO, right?
He was Dr. Mitta, who was the first employee at Wipro. And he walked out and he said, who are you? And so the point is going in with, some degree of not knowing and being okay with making a mistake is kind of what I think, I keep reminding myself.
Yeah.
And knowing that I don't know something, it's sometimes we just don't acknowledge the limits to our knowledge, and we just say, well, I know it, I've done it. It's just stupid, I think. So, it all works differently for each person, and it works for me. And it works for me to be able to say, I don't know, I have no idea, and just tell me what's the right way to do it. So I think that helps. So there you go.
It's the good naivety that kind of takes you places sometimes.
Yeah. I think it's at least you lose the pretense. This pressure that we have to be all knowing and knowledgeable, and you have to sound smart, and you have to sort of understand what's going on about everything. Oh, no bloody idea.
Yeah.
It's okay. Well, there's no shame in it. It's like, it's okay to say, I don't know.
Well, that's a great note to end the episode on, because one thing I constantly keep thinking about is the onus is never on me to sound smart on my episodes, which is great. It's always the guest who needs to sound smart.
Well, I don't know if I sound smart. Hopefully I sound authentic.
You do, of course.
Yeah. But I think, I think this is, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and invariably the ones that I get attracted to are where, there's a human element to, the stories, and that really touches me all the time, and I learn from it. So
And that's what I've enjoyed the most about this episode as well, is we talked very little about just the investing angle, but more to do with like people, relationships,
Yeah.
things that are underlying things that you don't often get to see when somebody makes an investment or somebody has accomplished so much in their lives.
Yeah.
So thank you for walking us down memory lane and exposing us to all of the things that have played a huge role in your life and things that have gotten you this far in your career as well. Hopefully we and our listeners, and myself included in that, get to learn. And I want to bring you back and keep having this conversation over and over again, because I do think there's so much that you can add, and we've only scratched the surface in terms of what the conversation here could look and feel like in the coming years. And I'd like to thank you on behalf of all of our listeners, me, for taking some time out sitting here and sharing your story with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was enjoyable. So thank you.
Hey, if you made it this far, first of all, thank you so much for your support. It truly means a lot to me and my team, who spend countless number of hours recording, producing, and pushing this content out to you. We have recorded some great episodes with fantastic guests here in Silicon Valley, and I can't be more excited to bring this to each and every one of you. If you like this episode or any of the audio ones that we've brought to you in the past, please make sure you hit the subscribe button. My only request to you would be to like, share, and if possible, leave some feedback and comments in the section below so that we can improve and bring to you some of the best content from leaders here in Silicon Valley who are investing and building great companies. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.